sort of fire and policing at the moment, and what the future of that is looking like at the moment. Sort of like maybe 15-20 minutes, and then we'll sort of throw it open to people to ask questions, if that sounds all right.
Yes, no, that's fine. So as you said, it's my new brief. I was the Shadow Housing Minister for 2 years. I first came into Parliament in 2017. I stood in 2015 against Gavin Barwell, who was the previous Housing Minister and then Chief of Staff to Theresa May. I lost by 165 votes in 2015, so I know the pain of losing very acutely. And then Gavin wrote a book, How to Win a Marginal Seat, which some people might have read. And then I fought him again in 2017 and won, which was very satisfying, in particular because he'd spent those years writing a book about how to win, and then resoundingly lost. So having been MP for a couple of years, in 2017, it was really clear on the doorstep that crime was a huge issue that was coming up. And I don't think we probably responded in the way that we should have done. By 2017, the impact of the cuts were significantly more apparent to the wider population than they had been in 2015. And people on the doorstep were talking to me a lot about the lack of visible policing, about the fear of crime, about the rise of certain kinds of crime. And it was brought up by young and old alike. And in fact, in the 2017 election, one of the people that I canvassed, I had a long chat on his doorstep with, was subsequently murdered a few months later through knife crime. So it's a very real issue for me. And in those 2.5 years before I got to this point, I set up and chaired the all-party group on knife crime, so spent a lot of my time when I wasn't doing housing talking about policing and talking about crime, and why it was that under the Conservatives violent crime had doubled, and somehow we weren't managing to get that message across, that actually it was directly down to the choices that the government of the day had made, not something that just randomly happened. So in 2019, I think the election was even more clearly, the public were even more, concerned about crime by the time we got to the election in 2019. And for me in Croydon, it was the #1 issue that I talked about and I campaigned on. And I think it speaks to the issue about what we in the Labour Party are trying to do. And I saw yesterday was the anniversary of the death of John Smith, and Keir tweeted one of his quotes about how when we win when we embody the lives and the aspirations of the ordinary people. And I think in 2019, one of those fears for ordinary people was crime, and the impact of the lack of policing and the cuts to various different sectors that had caused that increase. And I think we didn't make enough of that, and I think we should have done, but I'll come back to that. So the starting point is to say that everything is overlaid with COVID at the moment, as you would expect, and the police have had quite a tough time trying to come to terms with what has been forced on them, really, in terms of the changes that happened. So when the Prime Minister first introduced lockdown, there was a Cobra meeting something like 3 hours before that announcement. So Martin Hewitt, who runs the MPCC, was there, but that was the only notice that they had. And of course, there was no legislation, there was no structure, there was no guidance. So the rhetoric from ministers was quite strong. And actually, what was in the legislation was not quite as strong as what the ministers had been saying. So the police were having to try and implement and try and enforce, firstly, something that didn't exist in legislation, and then also something where there were slightly mixed messages about what was supposed to happen. So I think they did pretty well given the circumstances, and virtually all of the, probably because the public have been very sensible and done what they were asked to do, but the policing of lockdown has been relatively straightforward. There have been a few mistakes which were very well documented in terms of, you know, police getting a bit over the top when people were visiting certain rural areas or whatever. But in the main, they kind of said when they'd overreacted, they said they had, and in the main they policed it very well. Of course, the scientists had predicted a 50% adherence to the new lockdown rules, and of course it was about 80%, I think, people have pretty much done what they were told to do, so that numbers are higher in terms of what people expected. So the police were worried there might be some public disorder, there might be some problems. Those things haven't emerged. There were some wobbles with things like PPE with the police at the start, because were they getting the PPE in the same way, the same problem that the whole of the public sector has had? You know, most acutely the health service, the police had the same problem. But what's happened during lockdown is really interesting, because obviously crime in large part has reduced. Certain crimes, on-street crime, burglaries, those kind of things. Criminals have been quite savvy in terms of working out other ways to do things. The police had a worry that crime, ridiculously, was actually increasing at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night when everyone was clapping the NHS. Actually, criminals were out doing things they shouldn't have been doing. Where we have seen crime increase, domestic violence, online downloading of child imagery and grooming online, all of those kind of issues, we have seen an increase, and that's been very worrying. But the police, because they've had more capacity, because they're not policing the large events, they're not in football stadiums, they're not at airports, they actually have more capacity, and their numbers are quite high. They haven't got many off sick. They've actually been able to be much more proactive on serious organised crime, and they've made a lot of arrests. And in the Met, for example, they've shut down hundreds of county lines because they've been able to be proactively policing. And what the police have said to me is, this is what policing ought to be, this is what policing used to be. And of course it's because they've got the capacity to do the prevention and to go and fix the crimes, and that's the impact of 10 years of cuts, that they haven't been doing that. So they, you know, you'd speak to police officers who've been in service for years and years, and they'll say, this is what it was like when we first started. We're actually out there catching criminals, and that's what we want to be doing. So it's been an interesting time. Obviously the new guidance has come out again, from the Prime Minister on Sunday, and again the police didn't have any instruction on that at all. They've just had a one-sider of guidance instructions. We're waiting from the College of Policing for more guidance to come. So they're trying to second guess what they're supposed to be doing, and of course it's impossible to police really effectively the new guidance. They need to just be calling out the very extreme cases of people doing what they shouldn't be doing. I mean, they can't be, you know, as they've said on the press today, they can't be measuring the distance between people and, you know, intervening on these smaller issues. They're going to have to stick to the big issues. So moving on to the kind of bigger picture, a couple of initial things to say. The first is that politically, for the Labour Party, the job that we have is to convince people that we will keep them safe. That is our job to do. So we need to support the government in their attempts to get us through the COVID crisis, but call out when they're getting it wrong. But on crime, you know, we need to be completely clear about why crime has increased, what has caused that, but what we will do about it. And it's our job to support the police, to call out when they get things wrong, but to be there as a party that can be trusted to keep people safe. And that will be the big challenge for us as we head towards the next election. And that's very much what Nick Thomas-Symonds, new Shadow Home Secretary, wants to do. It's very much what I want to do. The nature of policing has changed dramatically over the years in some ways, and remains exactly as it always was in others. So when you look ahead to the future of policing, there are some interesting shifts and some things that will remain the same. First shift is obviously the focus in terms of different types of crime that we see through fraud and online crime, online child sexual abuse, hate crime online, that whole business of crimes that are committed in other countries. So if you're a victim of fraud, you know, it might be the perpetrator is in China and you're in this country, and the police are having to try and deal with that, and the police frankly haven't dealt with that on any level. I don't think anybody would say they have. The number of online fraud crimes has absolutely rocketed, and there is no proper system to fix that at all. The vast majority of those crimes never get investigated. Nothing ever gets done because there just isn't the capacity. We haven't quite worked out how to do that yet in terms of those big criminal gangs and the fraud. Obviously, terrorism, the nature of terrorism has changed, and there's more resources needed there. There have been a lot of historical child sexual abuse claims, which have taken a lot of time of a lot of police, and that has shifted where some of the priorities have had to be. That kind of old triangle of, you know, your criminal and your police and your victim are all in the same area, as I say, has changed when it comes to those big fraud crimes. But then what remains the same is that we still live in a society where there will be people breaking into houses, people breaking into cars, and people fighting each other and hurting each other, and we need to deal with that on a, you know, street policing level in this pretty similar way that we used to. So some things have completely changed and some things remain the same. And, you know, throughout the last 10 years, we've seen a hollowing out of resources. So all of those things are much harder to do. It's not just the frontline policing that's gone, it's the people who gather the data that tell us what's going on so we understand what the trends are about. You ask the police about drugs, for example, they won't really know. We don't really know very much about how the kind of drug market is working in this country, because we don't really measure or look at or understand quite a lot of that, and it's partly because those officers who those staff in the police force who were looking at these kind of things have all been cut back as well as everybody else. So lots of challenges. Our politics is we need to persuade people we can keep them safe. So what does that mean for the party and for what our policies should be? Well, there's three main areas. One is we need to put policing back on a strong footing in terms of financially. There is a risk already to the 21,000 extra police that Boris Johnson promised. We've seen letters suggesting that some of that funding for recruitment might be shifted to cover some of the COVID costs, because although, as I said, the crime has kind of changed during this period, police are getting less income from things like leasing football matches, and they're having to spend money on different things, so there's a shortfall. So protecting that money, also protecting the promise that it would be for also take into account people who leave the service. So it's not actually 21, it's more like 46,000 that we need when you take into account people who are retiring and leaving. So that 46,000 we need to try and hold on to make sure they do actually recruit that number. We also, I know the police are concerned that the promise was made for frontline policing. Well, what we don't want is for 46,000 new frontline police and then they cut all of the staff. So, you know, forensics, for example, they're not frontline police, but they're the people that will come into your house to check to see if they can get any evidence after you've been burgled. Well, we don't want those people cut back either, because they've been massively cut back already. And you know, a lot of them have very stressful jobs. People who answer 999 calls, 30% sickness rate in those roles, because it's just enormously stressful, as you can imagine. Well, that's staff, and we need to make sure they're protected as well. Within that staffing, we need to look at the mix as well. We've got one, I think, BAME chief constable across the whole country at the moment, and if you look at some of the patterns about who's more likely to be disciplined, you know, there are some worrying things in there as well. Female officers, again, at the very senior levels, we need to do some work on, and as I understand it, and I don't know this for sure, but as I understand it, the introduction of police and crime commissioners hasn't actually improved that mix, whereas you would hope it would have done. Making sure policing is understood, so the College of Policing, who set the guidelines and who are really important in terms of everybody understanding what it is that they're supposed to be there, and the inspection regime, so that when police are doing things they shouldn't be doing, there is a good structure in place to independently look at that. And a good example was last week when we saw that horrific video of a man being tasered in Manchester, with his young, I think it was his son there. It looked horrible. Maybe that it, you know, was justified because the man was a significant risk, I don't know, but we know that that's being independently investigated, and that's, you know, we need to make sure those systems are really solid, because otherwise you lose the trust, and you know, in this country we police by consent, and if you lose that, then you haven't got anything. So first chunk is funding and a strong footing and a strong workforce. Second chunk is being much better at prevention. So, you know, all the work on how you prevent crime, a lot of it isn't about police funding, it's about other things. You look at where the biggest youth services have happened across the country. There is a definite trend, and I've mapped it through the APPD. The areas with the highest cuts to youth services have the fastest rising knife crime. It's not direct. You can't say because you cut that youth club that knife crime occurred, but there is a trend that is absolute, and there to be seen. Another trend is where there's been a big increase in school exclusions, which there have, because school budgets are cut, teaching assistants are cut, kids with special needs don't get the support that they should have. They kick off in class because they're not being helped, and they end up being excluded from school. And you know, we know the patterns that follow from that in terms of involvement in crime. These things that are there, the evidence is there. The government, Theresa May, was sort of thinking about the public health approach to fighting crime, which is about, you know, looking at the causations as well as tackling the crime itself, and being much more evidence-led about how you reduce those levels of crime. Boris Johnson, not so much. Boris came in and said, we're going to have more police, we're going to have more prison places, we're going to have secure units in schools, we're going to give more powers to teachers to exclude kids and to discipline them. Is a very different rhetoric. We're going to do more stop and search, very different. So we need to try and claw some of that policy back and push that out. Sadiq Khan's been trying to do it through the violent crime violence reduction unit in the GLA, and there are pockets around the country where the government has funded violence reduction units. Problem with violence reduction, as we know from America, as we know from Scotland, as we know from many places, it's a long-term thing. This is a 10-year project. The violence reduction unit budgets are annual. So you get money which you can give to projects, and you have to say to the projects, look, can you give me some results in a year, please? Because otherwise I can't justify getting money next year. And of course, when it comes to violence reduction, that's actually really hard to do. So strong footing in terms of funding, flipping a lot of resources onto prevention, not just dealing with the crime. And then there's a kind of package of interesting issues around equality and human rights, and you know, tasering and when we use that is one of those. Facial recognition technology is another one. So the police now in London using facial recognition, which has many flaws and no legal underpinning at all, but they're using it already. Is that right? Should we be doing something about that? And stop and search, which is still a huge issue. Much better than it was in terms of, it used to be that the police found one thing wrong in every 10 stop and searches back in the day, when you know, back in the kind of Stephen Lawrence days. It got to about 1 in 3, which is good. Boris is increasing stop and search, even though he reduced it when he was Mayor of London. He's increasing it, and it doesn't have you know, the evidence is, as we know, not great, both in terms of the people who are stopped and searched in the first place, but then what happens to them subsequently. So if you're black and you're stopped and you're found with something, you are more likely to be charged than if you're white and you're stopped and you're found with something. It's not just who people are stopping, it's also what happens to you after that point where there's discrimination as well. So there's lots of issues around that. I'll take a pause now. I don't know if people want me to talk about, if you want me to mention fire briefly, or whether I've talked enough already and people might want to talk a bit about policing, some questions.
Yeah, I think if we, I mean, I've got a few questions as well. I mean, if people want to, hopefully they've got access to the chat below. I know Adam sort of set this up. So if you do have a question, you do want to get in touch, then by all means pop it in the chat, and we'll get through to them. But no, I think, and obviously, like I say, if you do have anything sort of specific to fire, that would also be helpful, just to make sure that we sort of cover that base as well. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's obviously quite a lot of stuff going on at the moment, just in terms of, like I say, the response to COVID. But yeah, I actually work at the GLA in my day job, so I know about the VRU and sort of like obviously the effect that has. But you're right, it's going to take years for that to like really sort of kick in and have sort of a full effect. So yeah, I mean, obviously I just want to cover, like, obviously you mentioned about like enforcement, and like obviously there's been very little sort of guidelines in sort of response to COVID. I know, for example, that the Met handed out some like 634 fines by the end of April, but Thames Valley next door handed out 649 fines, despite being such a much smaller police force in terms of their population that they cover. So like, is that really the reason why that variation existed? Is just because they didn't have clear enough guidance? And you saw that, I don't know, the Derbyshire example obviously is one that's quite prominent and what most people will have seen. And obviously, do you think that then? Do you think the lockdown then has been sort of strict enough? Do you think that the police should have been able to enforce more? And you saw police out on the streets in Spain and Italy telling people to go home, but that hasn't really been the case here. Do you think that should have been the case, or?
Well, I think no, I think it was probably about right. We do have a different policing system here to other countries in so comparing them is difficult. We do police by consent very largely. We don't have kind of armed police walking through the streets, and because the response to the instructions was so strong from the public, the police didn't need to be overly dramatic in terms of their responses. So when lockdown first happened, I got quite a lot of emails, and I'm sure all MPs did, from people saying, well, my neighbour had a barbecue last night, and are you going to tell the police? And you say, well, the barbecue is probably finished now. Everyone's gone, and I'm not sure I'm going to tell the police about that. So there was a sort of initial phase where everybody was watching everybody else and being outraged when people weren't doing what they should have done. But in the vast majority of cases, and we've seen that with the number of cases of COVID coming down we've seen the response to the fact that the public have largely done the right thing. I mean, it was difficult. So yesterday I was talking to the police. Obviously the Prime Minister made his announcement on Sunday. It was due to be implemented today. I was talking to them yesterday morning. They were waiting for this one pager of guidance, which was going to the Home Secretary yesterday lunchtime to then be signed off and sent round to all the police forces yesterday afternoon. I don't know what time they got it in the end, but that was just a one pager with all the vast complexity of everything. And then the extra guidance is going to be written by the College of Policing and come in a few days. So it doesn't, what the police have said is basically, we can't at this point, we can't police this in any way other than only looking at real obvious 30 people having a party that's what we're going to have to focus on. And there were other issues, like one of the senior police officers was saying to me, what on earth is going to happen when the Prime Minister, which he said on Sunday night, he's going to introduce people having to be quarantined for 2 weeks when they come into the country. Well, if you look at the figures, the revised figures from Visit Britain, it's something like I can't remember them. Millions of people are still expected to come into the country. I can't remember the number, but millions of people. So they come in, they turn up at Heathrow. We need a system somehow where we know where they're going to be staying, and where somebody at the airport can tell the local police force. Of course, there's all these different police forces, all kinds of different databases and different ways of doing things. So we have to tell the local police force that this person is supposed to be staying in this address for this period of time. No way the police are going to police that. I mean, maybe they could pop into one or two places, but in the main, I think it will be really obvious to people that that's not going to be a system that you can possibly police.
I just want to pick up on that point, because obviously, if officers, for example, for them to try to maintain social distance while obviously they can't work from home, like say, overwhelming majority of police staff can't. So Obviously while they're sort of out on the beat, social distancing is going to be really difficult. And obviously, you've maybe got your partner in your car that you go around with, but then you're entering multiple people's houses. If you have a particular, sort of crime to sort of settle in sort of individual properties. So how do you think we can keep like our frontline police safe?
Well, there was a bit of an argument about this a few weeks ago in terms of PPE, because the guidance says that you should be wearing, pretty much, if you're going into somebody else's house, you should probably be wearing PPE. And what the police had done more of in the first week, certainly, of the crisis, were, for example, they were going in and helping with when there'd been deaths in homes. And so obviously, if people have died of coronavirus, you need to make sure you've got the right PPE, and that was kind of fine. Where the issue was if you were, for example, driving in a van with 6 police officers, the guidance says you don't need to be wearing PPE. So that's the controversial bit at the moment in terms of the guidance, is if you are not able to social distance from your colleagues, you still don't wear masks at the moment. But I mean, that might change, but it is difficult. And I think the police felt, probably understandably, and I think other bits of the public sector felt the same, that they didn't want to make a fuss about it, because the priority was that the health service should get the PPE that they needed. And of course, that was a huge challenge. And I mean, the care homes here in Croydon, trying to get them PPE was a massive challenge. And we know, as Keir was talking about today in Prime Minister's Question Time, the impact of that. So they haven't really kicked off about it, but we do need to make sure everybody is going to be protected. And this is why the government's announcements on Sunday were so disappointing, because there's so many anomalies and so many inconsistencies that haven't been worked through at all, and you're just not, you can't really feel, I think, at the moment, entirely sure that they're doing the right things to keep us safe, which is deeply worrying, I think.
No, exactly. 100%. And obviously, I mean, sort of slightly related to that a little bit in terms of going into people's homes. Obviously, domestic abuse charities have seen a huge rise in calls in their helplines over the last 7 weeks. Do you think government advice and support for those sort of fleeing those situations has been enough? And, has it been quick enough, as well as going far?
So Jess Phillips is in the shadow team and leads on domestic violence, and we had the start of the domestic violence bill a couple of weeks ago, second reading. The response has been, if you talk to her, the response has been pretty woeful. She has, her and Nick have really struggled to get the government to act swiftly on these issues. And what we saw is they made announcements about funding that then just didn't get to the front line for weeks. So they promised money and didn't give it out. So all of those charities and helplines, which have been massively cut back anyway. We know women's refuges and, have really suffered in the last 10 years. And although the domestic violence bill is good, it needs to go further, but the response, I think, has been slow. It's been difficult in their defence for local police forces, who I've talked to quite a lot of local police chiefs about this, and they are struggling because they see the numbers of calls going up to advice lines rocketing, but the number of calls to the police, of course, aren't. So how do they find those people who are clearly suffering but aren't going to the police, and how do they find ways of reaching out to them? And that's really difficult. So one of the things, for example, where there's vulnerable children, so children who are under a social worker, were all told they could go to school, and they should have gone to, that all the way through. Key workers and children with social workers were told to go to school. Hardly any of them have. So what's been happening is the teachers have been trying to contact them, and where they can't, they've been working with local police forces, who've been, in some cases, going physically to people's houses just to try and, where there's a vulnerable family, just physically go and see if everything's okay. Because, of course, if you've got a child with bruises going to school, the teachers see it. If they're at home, you don't see it. So the police have been trying to be, innovative in the things that they're doing, but it's been very hard. And that's why, if there'd been more funding for things like the big national campaigns to make people aware of where they can go, where they can get support, the phone lines, all of those kind of things would have been better. And we'll see when people can leave their homes more over time, whether some of them do then, because they're freer, whether they do then report the crimes that have taken place over this period or not. So we might see an uptick in reporting when our doors are opened a bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously, it's kind of one of those things when obviously crime sort of gets reported like that. Is it an indicative of a wider trend, or is it just the reporting has gone up? And obviously, yeah, like, there might be a spike which might make a good headline for a newspaper, but actually there is the fact that we've been in this situation, and it'll obviously, those figures will just come out in time. It's not to say that the crime isn't happening though. I just want to touch on something. Obviously, we talked about police numbers, and obviously, they talk about 21,000 new officers. I know that, Sadiq is quite keen and obviously sort of spends quite a lot of excess money he has sort of on sort of putting more frontline police officers in place. But you mentioned the forensics, and obviously there's quite a lot of stuff to do with detectives and investigative officers, many of whom will have left the police over the last decade, and they haven't necessarily been replaced in terms of, there's been sort of has there been kind of a loss of institutional knowledge in the police force over that time? Because if you lose detectives who've been working for sort of 20 years and they're replaced with fresh recruits, that's obviously great. But, I think some retired police officers have come back in response to the government's call for, this is obviously at the start of the crisis, thankfully they weren't needed probably as much as they might have been. But do you think that, sort of building up the police's institutional knowledge, how can we realistically achieve that? Is it asking these retired officers to stay on, or is it, have we got to wait a while for that to actually happen?
No, I mean, this is a worry. And just before this, I was trying to find the stat and I couldn't find it from my notes. I think in the Met, only a third of police have been there for more than 3 years. I think that's the stat, and that's what I wanted to check and I couldn't. But it's a very young workforce, and or not necessarily just young, but young in the job. So you're right. And of course, when COVID started, people had just taken on the first tranche of all the new recruits as well, and they struggled. So this was a whole new recruited force who came just before lockdown, and then had even less idea of how to implement it than everybody else. So yeah, there has been institutional loss of knowledge, and there's not much you can do about that. As far as I know, the numbers who've come back from out of retirement are really low. I think they were pretty much in the Met and not so much in other areas, and haven't been used that much. So I think things like training and the College of Policing and the Policing Foundation and all of the different organisations that help build up that body of knowledge, the academics who can tell us a lot about the patterns of crime, all these things are really important. And we've just got to deal with the force as it is now. I mean, there's still a lot of knowledge there, of course, but that is an issue. And the welfare of officers is an issue, and the number, I think the police force is getting better at looking after officers, but the number who have post-traumatic stress and who end up, in the past, who just end up taking early retirement because of that, very high. And you want to keep people well enough to stay in the job for long enough to become the experts who can then help the next. And I think, I've done a lot of work around the impact of trauma on children, and there's a lot going on about that at the moment. A lot of the work that I did with young people was around the impact of seeing their friends stabbed, and being in an environment where that kind of a level of violence was normal. Of course, if you're a police officer, you see people getting stabbed, and you have to be first on the scene and deal with these things as well. And I think we're coming to learn about the impact of trauma much more than we did, but I'm not sure we're quite there yet.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on something you mentioned in terms of obviously you mentioned that sort of more work has been sort of done on prevention, and obviously actually during I think the line you said was that police officers feel like it's sort of back to the old days in terms of police are doing what they should be doing, which is going out and catching criminals. What do you think that once we're sort of out of this, is there a way to kind of keep that focus? Because obviously rather than the kind doing the more preventative work and sort of stopping fires before they actually happen, that sort of that sort of thing. Do you think, how can we keep that going in a post-coronavirus world?
Well, part of it is basic resources, so having enough police to do the job, and the right kind of police doing the right thing. So we obviously, PCSOs were massively cut back. I mean, hugely cut back. I've lost something like 90% of PCSOs in Croydon. Well, different police have different views on that type of policing, but in our experience, and the evidence seems to bear this out as well, if you have neighbourhood police who have relationships with local people, they build up over time, they get to be trusted over time, that helps prevent crime. And I've talked to lots of young people who would say, well, there was this police officer, he knew me, so when I was doing something I shouldn't have been doing, he might, he'd take me home to my mum and talk to my mum about it, and she'd tell me off. Or you build up that trust. It's having police in schools. There's a school that I went to that had a police officer who was in there so regularly. Again, he built up relationships with people, and somebody told him when someone had gone missing, they were running county lines, so they disappeared, and the other pupils trusted this police officer enough to tell them that, so he could do something about it. So the part of it's resourcing, part of it's doing the right kind of policing and building up those relationships, and the community trust in police as well is still a huge issue, and you would prevent more crime if people trusted the police. And because in London, it's not the same everywhere, but in London, still most police officers are white, and there's a lot of violent youth crime that are young black boys, and until the police look like the people they're there to serve, it's hard to trust them in the way that we would want to. And which is exactly the same if you go to Glasgow, there'll be certain communities where everyone is white, but they live in a certain area and they get discriminated against by the police because they're from that estate. So discrimination exists in lots of different ways, but building up that trust so that you can actually understand crime and prevent it is really important. And then linking the police to all those other services, mental health services, schools, youth work, so that young people can make better choices, which is all that happens, is young people make really bad choices because there isn't a structure there to help them make the right choices. And that's what we need to put back, and that's a big building job of adults at the right places at the right time to help.
Yeah, no, exactly. I've got a question here from Pranav from the chat. So he says, on the topic of replacing of experienced officers, is there a drive by the Tories or the far right to capture the police force by populating it by far right sympathisers? I say that on the basis of the 21-year-old constable of the Metropolitan Police exposed as part of a right-wing group.
I don't think there's a deliberate strategy to do that. I think always within every organisation there'll be, and the police force could attract people that we don't want to be in the police force, and we need to have structures to make sure they can be discovered and chucked out of the force. But I don't see a deliberate thing there at all. No.
Okay. And obviously this is the Devolution local government network. So I do want to touch on police and crime commissioners
Yes.
and sort of the relationship with combined authorities. And obviously there've been quite a new development in the last decade. And I remember when police and crime commissioners came in, my mum worked on the polling stations back home in the West Midlands in Dudley. And she's like, people kept coming in saying, what am I voting for? And there's this real kind of, oh, it's a police and crime commissioner. Oh, right. No idea what that is. And they'd vote. But obviously, there's also a variety of different ways that they're kind of working. I know that in London, we have a Deputy Mayor for Policing, which is Sophie Linden. Obviously, there are other police and crime commissioners where they aren't combined with their combined authorities. The West Midlands still has a separate system. And I think Andy Burnham has a Deputy Mayor for Policing. So obviously, there's going to be some miss and match maybe for some time. But is there kind of one ideal way that you think would work best? I mean, obviously, they're still quite new, so there might be a good way of doing it or a bad way of doing it. We might not know yet, but what do you think should be the ideal structure for sort of policing in the city or a region?
Well, that's a big question to ask someone who's been in the job for 3 or 4 weeks. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, the policing as a whole has many different flaws in terms of the way it's structured, but the solutions can be as troublesome as the existing situation. So you've got layers of complexity of obviously the 43 police forces across the country, which is not how you would design it if you were starting from scratch. You've got the funding system, which is very old and based on completely out of date figures and doesn't take into account lots of things you should take into account. And then you've got layered over the top kind of devolution and PCCs. It's interesting. I've talked to the PCCs quite a bit since I started already, because trying to understand, obviously the election would have just happened for them, but it will be next year, and I'm hoping that we can, you know, hold our own and make some gains in the elections, because as you say, they're quite new, and we were on our sort of downward trajectory electorally when they came in, so maybe we can make some gains. But the ones that I know, oh
yeah, right. Shared house, and somebody's obviously,
gosh, I'll carry on. That was a alarm. Just to answer the question, a couple of examples. I've talked a lot to David Jameson, who's the West Midlands PCC, in the past, because he's doing some really interesting things on violence reduction and violence prevention, and he seems to have a good structure around him and a good ability to influence and to do the job. I was talking yesterday to the 2 Labour PCCs in Wales. There are 4 PCCs in Wales, 2 are Plaid Cymru and 2 are Labour. And what they've done is they work very effectively with the other Plaid PCCs. So the 4 of them, the 4 commissioners and the 4 police chiefs are in a kind of board where they sit together and they make decisions together and they talk together. And I think they've got a structure that they've developed that works for them, that enables them to talk about some bigger strategic issues about so in Wales, big issue of substance misuse, for example, very high levels of death through substance misuse in Port Talbot and Swansea in particular, and other areas. So they work together very effectively, but they've kind of developed that themselves. And that's my sense of it, is that people are sort of developing different ways to work that work for them locally. Now, whether that has worked in every area, I don't know. And there is something uniquely peculiar about the way the structure is set up, I think, where the PCC has this direct control over the appointment of the most senior police chief. So that relationship is enormously could be fraught with difficulties, just because the power dynamic of that single relationship. But then who's to say a better model, a different model would be better? I think where people are learning and working together and finding ways of looking at things strategically and not just focusing on some of the smaller, more day-to-day issues, it seems to be working. But I'm going to take the lead on the PCC campaign, so I'll spend quite a lot of time travelling around the country, talking to them and working out, and helping our guys campaign. So, I might have a better answer to your question in a year's time.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, sorry about the fire alarm, by the way. One of my housemates obviously set it off cooking dinner, of all the times to do it as well, which is perfect. One more question on policing, and then I think we'll have like a little bit more time to sort of cover fire. And this is from Marcus, who's put in the chat. How would you counter the Tories' tough on crime message? I know there is a lot of things that you're proposing, but how do we emphasise that Labour are not soft on crime?
It's really important, and it speaks to the fundamental point I was saying, that we have to persuade people we will keep them safe, and that means being tough on the criminals. But there is, and we have to be really clear about that. And I have yet to discover a better phrase. I would love to come up with one, but the tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime is pretty much where we want to be. And the thing that I have tried to push over the last 3 years doing the knife crime stuff again and again, the Tories have doubled violent crime has doubled under the Conservatives. They have made us less safe. We are not safe under the Conservatives. And we know through the evidence about how we can prevent crime, that we can prevent crime, and that these things are not inevitable, and that we can protect people. So I think, supporting the police, of course, calling them out when they get things wrong, but being there to support them, having the right arguments about funding for them, about how you prevent crime, have to be the things that we talk about all the time. And I know it's difficult. I mean, Boris's and Priti Patel, their response in terms of let's increase stop and search, lock up more people, it's just, it speaks to such a base kind of it's difficult, and we need to make sure we're combating that with the evidence about what they've done to this country, making it less safe, making our police more demoralized than they've ever been, and that we can fix that. And and crime was in a much better place when we were last in power, but it's hard to compare because the nature of crime and policing has changed. But it's a really good point, and goes to the absolute core of whether we'll win the next election or not, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think if we can demonstrate that in obviously like the areas we do have government, such as Wales and London, then obviously we can sort of say, well, so hopefully Sadiq will get re-elected, and the next election, general election, we'll be able to say, well, actually violent crime has gone down in London, but nationally it's actually gone up, and that's probably the Tories' fault. So I think if we move on to sort of the firefighting side of things, and the firefighting side of your brief, obviously Grenfell is the big issue in terms of in the world of fire at the moment, and obviously there are still hundreds of buildings across the country that have flammable cladding, and the government really has been really slow in providing the funding even before we sort of had the current pandemic. Fire brigades still don't have a way of fighting that particular type of fire in a tower block, as far as I'm aware. I know that the London Fire Brigade have drawn up a plan, but they haven't even agreed it internally, let alone implemented it nationally. So what steps are you currently taking to get the government to deal with this sort of urgently?
So I was the housing minister with responsibility for Grenfell for the last couple of years, so I've been dealing with this for a long time. So the initial response to Grenfell was woeful, as we know, and promises made by the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, saying that she would do everything it took to keep people safe, which just completely they failed to do. And it's a Grenfell United and the local community there have been amazingly strong in the way that they've carried on fighting for justice for people in Grenfell, people who were affected in the tower and around. But there's, as you say, there's this raft of issues that have come to the fore that we knew were there, but the government did nothing about. And one of the most awful things was the all-party group for fire safety, which is chaired by a Tory, led by a lot of backbench Tories, and Jim Fitzpatrick was the kind of Labour co-chair, that they had sent letter after letter after letter to minister after minister after minister since the Lakanal House inquiry, saying you have to do something about this because there will be another fire. And the last letter they sent was to Gavin Barwell about 3 weeks before the Grenfell fire, saying you have to do something about this. And the government just didn't. And it was a massive ideological thing about, well, lots of issues, but fundamentally, a failure to understand the value of regulation and to think that, it was, Cameron and his bonfire of regulations, and Eric Pickles, and, trying to let, anybody do whatever they wanted to do, and very light touch intervention led to this problem. So we have loads of buildings covered in exactly the same style of cladding, still haven't been removed. We have loads of buildings covered in HPL cladding, different kind of cladding, just as flammable. We have loads of tall blocks that don't have sprinklers. We have loads of blocks that don't have proper fire doors. The government has released certain amounts of money, nowhere near enough, but the legal rigmarole of getting that money means that virtually none of it has been spent yet. And there are literally millions of people living in flats right now who could not sell their flat if they tried, because you need a piece of paper that says your building is safe, and there aren't enough people and there aren't enough processes to get those pieces of paper. So there are hundreds of thousands of people who are literally trying to leave and can't, because they're either covered in terrible cladding and facing bills to replace that cladding, or they just can't get the legal documents. And meanwhile, the fire service has been cut by 11,000 people. So you have far fewer firefighters, you have far fewer fire stations, you have far fewer fire engines, you have longer times to get to a fire. I mean, they're very small time periods, so it might be that the length of time, average time in an area might have increased by 30 seconds, but in 30 seconds a lot can happen in a fire, and this is bad. They really need to be properly funded, and the government need to properly fund this vast array of buildings that are unsafe, and they need to change the law so that this cannot happen again. And they introduced the first bit. We had the second reading of the fire safety bill 2 weeks ago, which I spoke at, which is a tiny piece of legislation that does one tiny little thing, and that's the first piece of primary legislation they've introduced in the nearly 3 years since Grenfell. It's been absolutely shocking response from government, and partly because we've had so many different secretaries of state, so many different housing ministers. It's not seen as a sexy department, it's not seen as the place to be. Everyone who's in that role is looking somewhere else. You've got people like Kit Malthouse who are just like looking to the politics of where they're going to go next and not dealing with the problems, and it's just been utterly woeful.
Yeah, no, I know from Copy really well, and we famously talk about how many housing ministers there's been in the last 10 years, and it's into double figures, I think now. It's getting
10,
very close.
10
in a bit years, 10 years, like, one a year. And you're right, they kind of use it as a staging post for their next job in government, rather than actually dealing with the issues, because that's why the housing crisis just gets worse. So yeah, obviously you mentioned the fire safety bill. I think the building safety bill is sort of a bigger piece of legislation the government are working on, and obviously there's like a much bigger task if, for example, all of the buildings obviously that have to then be brought up to those standards. But what sort of amendments will Labour be pushing for on that bill, and indeed the fire safety bill, if any?
So the building safety bill is the response to the Hackett inquiry, which was set up by the government after. So there's two big things that kind of happened after Grenfell in terms of looking at what needed to change. Dame Hackett was asked to look at the building control system. So how does a building get built, and what kind of measures and controls have to be in place? What kind of what kind of material can you use? How do you do it? And then the inquiry led by Martin Moore-Bick into the Grenfell fire itself. And we've had the first phase of that inquiry, which focused on what happened on that night of the fire. The second phase hasn't started yet, and the second phase is about why was the building in the state it was in, basically, in order, that meant that the fire had such a horrific impact, and that hasn't even started. So you've got that whole piece of work that still has to come. But after Hackett didn't go anywhere near far enough, and there are lots of questions about whether the government will go far enough in their legislation. We haven't seen it yet, so we don't know kind of what's going to be in there. But the fire safety bill, as an example, is this tiny piece of legislation that changes one thing for the better, and there's a vast array of other things that we need to change for the better as well. So just to use one example, the way that buildings are inspected to see if they're safe is basically a privatised system. Anybody can set themselves up as a fire inspector who can go and look to see if your building is, has the things it should have. You don't need any qualifications. You just call yourself that and go and set yourself up and go and do it. And that is ridiculous. And it used to be a much stronger system. You need the fire service and local authorities at the core of the enforcement of fire safety, and they're not really at the moment. And that's a big part of what needs to change that isn't in the government sites at the moment at all. So, and the government hasn't, for example, said that you should put sprinklers into tall buildings. So if you build a building now, a tall building, you have to put sprinklers in because the government says it's essential. But if you live in a tall building that doesn't have sprinklers, the government says, no, you're right, which is clearly wrong. So, I mean, there are loads of things they should be doing that they're not.
No, exactly. And I'm conscious of time, and obviously we'll try and wrap up in a little bit, but obviously just to sort of bring it back full circle, back to COVID-19, the pandemic, but sort of from a fire perspective. And fire brigades seem to have taken on like a number of new duties as a result. I think it's called blue light collaboration, where they'll respond to any sort of blue light call, and often for a number of reasons they tend to be there first. But obviously another particular example I think was terrorist attacks as well. They could be first on the scene, but because these are not formally part of the fire brigade's role, they might not necessarily have the training or the equipment that they need in order to sort of respond to that adequately.
Yeah.
So what do you think the role of the fire brigade should be? Do you think that there should be more blue light collaboration and sort of responding to an emergency no matter what it is, or should it be sort of fire and rescue in the traditional sense?
So that's a deeply contentious issue that and an ongoing debate. The worry that the fire service have, quite understandably, when people sort of talk about closer collaboration, is that you'll end up with a police station and a fire and the fire station in the same building, that there's a kind of crossover of roles, that and are people being trained, are they being paid for doing what they should be doing, or are we distracting them from their core job, which is fighting fires? And it is a difficult one. I don't there's a worry from the unions that the government want to sort of bring policing and fire service together more. I'm not sure yet whether that's the case. I don't get that sense yet, but that may be true. I don't see there's any huge sense in doing it particularly. The fire service is also the most trusted of all the emergency services, and more so than the police, and they want to keep their understandably they want to keep their personality separate from the police force. But in COVID, there has been amazing collaboration. So in the London Fire Service, for example, I think they've had 300 people helping to man ambulances. They've had a couple of births that they've overseen. The firefighters have overseen.
Yeah, I don't think that's in the firefighters training at all.
They have been helping again with the coroners in the process when people died, and I think because there are fewer fires now than there were, sometimes people look at what firefighters are doing and going, aha, here's an opportunity for us to get them to do loads of other things. And that's a worry, because the firefighters have to be on hand, trained, practicing all the time, training all the time for fires. And we know from Grenfell, we know from fires that have happened since, that when large fires occur, we need to have enough firefighters there, and that needs to be their core job. And so you've got to maintain that and maintain their ability to do that job properly, and then have a conversation about what else they can do. I mean, I was in Theresa May had a big summit on knife crime in Number 10, and I was there sitting with various different ministers and experts and the like, and one of the ministers was like, well, firefighters go into people's homes and are trusted, and they go in to look at smoke alarms. Could we get them to have a role in, if they see something that they think a child is at risk, could they be doing something about that? It's like, well, maybe, but probably that would be quite a hard thing to train them for and get them to do. So it's always difficult, because they are trusted and they are great, and the public do very much value them. So you can understand the question being asked, but I think the priority has to be on making sure they can fight fires.
Yeah, and obviously, in terms of if they were to go into a house where they did sort of see maybe sort of child with bruises on, or they might clarify that. I mean, maybe give them the training to raise it as an issue to the
Yes.
to the sort of
Of course.
raise alarm bells, but maybe not give them the training to deal with it themselves if might be one sort of compromise. But
exactly.
there's lots more I can cover, and lots more that like we didn't get to. And obviously, there's a few people who sort of asked questions and we haven't got round to them. So I'm sorry about that. And obviously, there's a few more on my list that we didn't get a chance to cover either. But Sarah, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us this evening.
You're welcome.
Really, obviously, I think a lot of people here might not necessarily know too much about the police or the fire, and obviously, it's really informative just to sort of learn a bit more about it and what sort of the current issues that is ongoing in sort of both of those. So thank you so much. It's been really, really great.
You're welcome. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
See you, Sarah.
Yeah.
And everybody else, thank you so much for attending. If you don't already follow us on Twitter, it's YFDevo, that's DEVO, local gov is our network's Twitter. Young Fabians is the general one. And tomorrow night we have Fangam Debonair coming to speak on housing. Which would be really interesting and really quite topical given Labour announced some housing policies last week. And Friday we have our weekly quiz. So if anybody wants to join along with that, then they can do, and details can be found on the Young Fabians social media and on their website. That's it from me. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and apologies about the fire alarm. I'm going to have a go at one of my housemates now. Enjoy the rest of your evening, folks, and take care. Bye.